Who has ever felt inadequate for a task? Like you weren't good enough for something? I know that I have. I can remember a few times that I officiated at funerals in Forsyth and came out of a side room with the family only to discover about 300 people in the room, which is about a third of the whole town of Forsyth. Those were moments when I felt inadequate. And this feeling of inadequacy, of not being worthy, it's common enough that there is a term for this psychological condition: imposter syndrome. And the internet's source of all wisdom describes this as a psychological experience in which a person suffers from feelings of intellectual and or professional fraudulence. A researcher also defined it as the subjective experience of perceived self-doubt in one's abilities and accomplishments compared with others, despite evidence to suggest the contrary. Now, the good news is that even though this name is new, the idea of this feeling of inadequacy for a task is nothing new. In fact, it is downright biblical. Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, there are countless examples of people that God called to be prophets, and yet they would say that they were unworthy. It happened with Samuel, with Jeremiah, with Moses. And today's first reading even covers Isaiah's calling and his protest. Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I have lived among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And today's gospel provides us with yet another quintessential case of imposter syndrome. We heard from Luke's 5th chapter, and yet another pivotal moment in Jesus' early ministry. Jesus was surrounded by crowds of people on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He needed a bit of space, breathing room. And so he conscripted a nearby fisherman's boat and asked him to take it out a bit. And then, while close to the shore, Jesus talked to the crowds from the boat. Afterward, he asked the fishermen to go out into deep water and to cast out the nets. The fishermen protested a bit. He'd been fishing all night and caught nothing. And then he pulled in the net, and it was overflowing. He called in the other boat to help haul it in. And at this fisherman fell to his knees and said he was unworthy of being in the presence of Jesus because he was a sinful man. But Jesus responded, saying, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." And after this, that fisherman, Simon Peter, began following Jesus that day, along with James and John, who'd been in the other boat. Simon Peter felt unworthy. He felt like an imposter. He bore witness to Jesus doing the seemingly impossible. And he fell to his knees and confessed that he was a sinner and unworthy. And typically, imposter syndrome is a false feeling of inadequacy. However, in Simon Peter's case, he was indeed unworthy. He was a sinner, as we all are. And therefore, he wasn't worthy of being in the presence of the divine. And yet, he was. Why is that? Why was Simon Peter able to be in Jesus' presence and to follow him? In our second reading today, we heard Paul remind the believers in Corinth about the basics of the faith. And in that, we have our answer. He told them, in part, I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me has not been in vain. It was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. The answer to how Paul and Simon Peter were able to be with and follow Jesus is right here. One word. Grace. We are never worthy of God or of God's Son. We are not saved by our actions, but only by the grace of God. Now, as for what Jesus told Simon Peter, I uncovered a new, to me at least, and fascinating possible explanation. In verse 10, Jesus told him that from now on you will be catching people. Now, I, like most others, have always seen this as a call to evangelism. That Simon Peter and the disciples were to begin catching people by sharing the good news with them. However, there is at least one theologian with a different explanation. This theologian wrote, there is perhaps no expression more traditionally misunderstood than Jesus' invitation to these workers to become fishers of men. This metaphor, despite the grand old tradition of missionary interpretation, does not refer to the saving of souls, as if Jesus were conferring upon these men instant evangelist status. Instead, Jesus was intentionally referencing words from the prophet Jeremiah, who proclaimed that God would send many fishermen to catch the wicked and restore Israel. And elsewhere in the Hebrew scriptures, there are similar metaphors used as judgment upon the rich and the powerful. So in this interpretation, Jesus was inviting fishermen, examples of the working poor, to join the struggle to overturn the status quo of power and privilege. Another key theme here is abundance, divine abundance. Simon Peter and the others had been fishing all night, and they had caught nothing. So when the son of carpenter came, who came from nowhere near any bodies of water, told them to go out into deep water, Simon Peter must have been very, very skeptical. But he did it, nonetheless. Simon Peter was stuck in a scarcity mindset, as we all often are. He was simply thinking about what he was lacking, while failing to see what was already in his midst. And then Jesus showed him that with him all things are possible. Jesus showed him the abundance that had been around him all along. Jesus asked Simon Peter to keep trying. He invited him to go into unfamiliar waters, to try something different. Simon Peter agreed. And then the Son of God revealed the abundance of God's grace and mercy to him. Simon Peter felt unqualified because he was, as we all are. But God doesn't call those who are already equipped. He equips those whom God calls. English, it's a fun language. Our job is to trust in God over our feelings and our fear. Simon, Peter, James, and John left everything they had behind to follow Jesus. That is what we are to do. And so, let us remember that while none of us can ever be worthy, we are all invited. And our job is threefold. Do not be afraid. Trust in God. And step out into the unknown in faith. For Simon Peter was neither ready nor worthy, but he believed in the one who called him. And so must we. Amen.